microphones.
Go.
Testing.
Talk. You can test. Go for it.
Testing. Testing. Centerville City Council meeting, July 6th.
Oh, yeah, I think you're.
Final testing. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. We're ready, Mr. Mayor.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the San Rafael City Council meeting of Monday, July 6th, 2020. And there was no closed session, and therefore we'll go into the regular meeting, and I'll ask the city clerk to take roll, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Present.
Vice Mayor Collin.
Present.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Present.
Councilmember McCullough.
Present.
Mayor Phillips.
Present, all accounted for, and if you would now inform the public how this evening will function with their involvement.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This meeting is being streamed live to YouTube, where viewers can provide comments in the live chat, or they are welcome to attend by telephone by calling 669-900-9128 and using the meeting ID 859-7732-5943 #. If you are watching on YouTube and you wish to comment on topics not related to this evening's agenda, please submit your comments now, as they will be read into the record shortly. If you're participating over the telephone and wish to provide public comments, please press *9 when the mayor invites public comments. When it is your time to speak, you will hear a notification that lets you know that you've been unmuted and you will have 2 minutes to speak and make your comments. If you're submitting comments on YouTube to be read aloud, please write public comment in caps, introduce yourself, and submit your comments. Please note that there is a character limit on YouTube, so you'll need to submit your comments in groups. Additionally, if you're planning to speak to the City Council on matters not on this evening's agenda, please submit your comments now, as that's the next item on the agenda or coming up shortly. And if you've submitted comments prior to the meeting by email or letter, that correspondence has been forwarded to the City Council and published to our meetings page on our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll turn to the city manager's report. Jim?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I have a couple announcements and updates tonight. I wanted to start off with a brief update on the status of the Mayor's Task Force looking at the use of force policies in our police department. As the Council knows, the Mayor has signed President Barack Obama's Mayor's Pledge to review San Rafael's use of force policies in the police department, and also requested a review based on the #8can'twait guidelines. The Mayor assembled a 15-member task force to do this over a period of weeks and then report back to the City Council in an open session for review and discussion. I just wanted to report that the task force held its first meeting on June 24th and started by getting to learn a little bit about each other. And then there was a review and questions and answers of an overview that the police department put together regarding use of force policies, and that's also on our website. There was some beginning discussion of the policies, and our group needed to review the information and come back and meet again. So we're actually meeting again this week on Thursday, and our intent is to get deeper into the policies and the meaning behind them. The group is being facilitated by Lorenzo Jones, who many of you know through his role serving as the board chair of the San Rafael Chamber of Commerce, or through his work on the board of the Boys and Girls Club of Marin and Sonoma County, or through his professional facilitation work. It's already clear we're just one meeting. We've just had the one meeting so far, but it's already clear how wonderful it is to have Lorenzo's input into the effort, and that it's great to have it facilitated by a third party that's focused on making it a meaningful process. So we are working to prepare for that meeting this Thursday. At the end of the process, as I mentioned, the group will ultimately report out to the full City Council in a public meeting. And then once that effort is complete, we've talked about continuing to focus on social and racial equity in a number of different ways. I wanted to talk about one of them tonight, which is, as you know, we typically do our annual goals and objectives along with our annual budget every year. This year, we delayed our annual goals and objectives because we were projecting an almost $12 million budget deficit through the end of last fiscal year and this next fiscal year through June 30th, 2021, due to the extreme revenue losses related to the coronavirus. We're very dependent on sales tax and also hotel taxes. So when those things are shut down or only partially open, it has a huge impact on our ability to operate the city. So we made cuts in every department. We knew that there'd be more expenditure reductions coming. So we held off on creating a new set of goals and objectives because I think the council wanted to make sure we had a good lay of the land in terms of the budget before we put together goals and objectives for the year. So the timeline actually ends up working really well with our focus on racial equity, as we'll be able to look at our goals and objectives through an equity lens. Through our goals, we'll be looking at all the services that the city provides and how we provide them, or how we want to provide them, or if we want to make any changes to that. I'll give a really quick example for community members who might not be familiar with that process that we do every year. Last year, we had a goal around facilitating housing opportunities and helping to create an equitable renter-landlord relationship. So staff worked with the City Council, the County of Marin, and other partners, and created an ordinance to prohibit source of income discrimination for renters, another ordinance to create a mandatory mediation program for larger rent increases, and a third to prohibit certain kinds of evictions that do not have a just cause. So the goals and objectives are one way that the City Council directs the work of the city departments and the types of programs, policies, and services that we provide. So it'll be a great opportunity to use an equity lens to examine new ways of doing things, not only in our police department, but in every city department, because it's going to be important to make changes such as those in the housing example above. That, you know, it really, social and racial justice issues touch every city department, just like they touch other parts of life, like access to healthcare, access to education, employment laws, prosecution and sentencing practices, and so much more. So we really want to take more of a comprehensive look at it in terms of city services, and using our goals and objectives will be one way that we can do that. So first, though, we're going to complete the review of the police use of force policies and recognize that that's just one step in the overall process. We do have a new webpage that I mentioned last time that I'll mention again, just in case we have new viewers, which is cityofsanrafael.org/racial justice. It's actually cityofsanrafael.org/racial-and-social-equity, but for speed, it's easier to go to cityofsanrafael.org/racial justice, and it'll bring you to that website. And it's a good place to see the progress that we've made, and also to provide your direct comments to us here at City Hall. We're going to take those comments and create a frequently asked questions right on that same webpage based on the input that we receive. So you'll be able to start seeing your questions answered on that page. So moving to coronavirus update, I wanted to just hit some highlights. We're now at almost 1,500 COVID-19 total positive cases in Marin County, with 34 current hospitalizations and 19 fatalities. I noticed the surveillance page at coronavirus.marinhhs.org didn't look like it was updated yet today, but those are the most recent numbers. The most significant recent news is that Marin County was added to the state's watch list last Friday, July 3rd. And the California Department of Public Health has created this watch list of counties where the COVID-19 situation has changed significantly in recent days, such as a spike in cases or confirmed positive cases, I should say, hospitalizations, outbreaks in congregate settings, or an increase in community transmission in the workplace. And Marin County as a whole is included, as we've been seeing significant COVID positive increases in these categories. One key impact is moving backwards, unfortunately, on recent openings, such as indoor dining. So indoor dining is now required to no longer operate for at least 3 weeks as of today, although outdoor dining and takeout are still allowed. So we'll be able to continue the Dining Under the Lights program, which we've been doing every Thursday night, where we close down portions of 4th Street. And as the council knows, it's a San Rafael Business Improvement District effort to get people back to work and support our local businesses and employees. So we'll still be able to do that because it's outdoor and because we've closed down large portions of 4th Street to allow for physical distancing. And then people are also welcome to just do takeout orders and come pick them up on any evening, but on that evening in particular during Dining Under the Lights. So the idea that we'd been on, which was there was kind of a 2-week cadence that was going on for reopenings, where kind of every 2 weeks there was a few more things that were added to the reopening list based on level of risk, and based on the positives and being on the state watch list and the things that I mentioned earlier, we're really not on that 2-week cadence right now. We're kind of waiting to see if we can get this particular spike to settle down through the different measures that we're taking. So we're not projecting, and the county public health is not projecting any kind of new changes for July 15th, which would have been like the next 2 weeks cadence in terms of additional reopenings. So the every 2-week concept is on hold right now. And our recent increases in the state's additional oversight is making the reopening plan a little bit less clear right now. I wanted to mention a few things about the things we've read about San Quentin State Prison, which absolutely has an impact in Marin County, but it's managed by the State of California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which is CDCR. So Marin County Public Health, that has so much jurisdiction on many of the things that I've been talking about, does not have jurisdiction over the state prison. There were a number of things I was going to share with you that I thought was fairly new information. I saw this afternoon that the CDCR has updated their website and has a new webpage that's called San Quentin State Prison Response. So that's actually a great location if you're interested in this topic to find out what's the absolute latest going on. That's a good place to look. It states a few things in brief. It states a unified command center has been established at the prison to coordinate custody and medical response. And it's composed of medical, custody, emergency management, and infectious disease experts from not just CDCR, but actually also California Correctional Healthcare Services, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, State Emergency Medical Services Authority. You can see a theme here, California Department of Public Health and their Division of Occupational Health and Safety. So Cal OES has established an incident management assistance team at the prison to support healthcare and medical response and coordinate operational logistics at the facility. There's a new ambulance strike team that's been added from the state, established to facilitate the transfer of patients to outside healthcare settings if needed. So the impact that we were originally seeing on fire departments and paramedics in Marin will be reduced or eliminated because of that. You've also probably seen pictures of the tents going up at San Quentin to support an alternative care site or alternative care stations to treat people right on the grounds and to open up space and to allow for increased physical distancing, quarantine, and isolation. So the website has information like that, and also testing data, all the numerical data, quarantine and isolation practices, how that works, staffing works, and information about expedited releases. So regarding overall responses to this increase in positive cases, I don't have a lot of good news when it comes to the numbers and the incidences of cases in Marin right now. But there is coordination and communication going on between the state and the county regarding San Quentin. There's a continued focus on infection control practices and testing at our residential care facilities and our skilled nursing facilities throughout the county. And there's an ongoing partnership, as it has been, with community-based organizations to increase testing and the access to care and support for vulnerable populations. So individually, for any one person that might be listening, one of the most important things we could do is wear a mask when outside of your home, whether it's an employee or a customer. Face coverings are required to be worn both indoor and outdoor businesses. They can be as simple as a cloth face covering or a bandana, but they must cover both the nose and the mouth. We are continuing to get information out on all the things that I mentioned. If anyone's watching and isn't getting this information, we've been doing something we've been calling San Rafael is Resilient a few times a week. And also I've been sending out my city manager snapshot newsletter before every council meeting. So you can go to citysanrafael.org/coronavirus and look at all the information that's the most recent and sign up for those things there. So thank you, Mayor and City Council, for the opportunity to provide these few updates and this information tonight. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that complete report on those topics you did touch on. They're important to our community. And you finished with it, San Quentin, and I did talk with several people involved. And I've received, as everybody knows by now, I suppose, almost 2,000 emails, and most of them any topic in the last, 8.5 years. So it's out and about. So I'm pleased that between the state and now the county and certainly through EOC and your involvement, it seems as though we've made good steps in addressing the issue there. So I hope that that matter gets more under control than certainly it has been. I should touch just very briefly on the report you made with regard to the police policies and procedures that we're reviewing. And I must say I'm most pleased with Lorenzo as our facilitator. He's been excellent in leading us through this topic. As difficult as it is, he's made it, I think, productive as can be. And I, too, need to compliment our community members that have been somewhat selected at random. Good input, bright folks, good point of view, and all, I'll quote, on the younger side, which we were trying to achieve as well with the, with the diversity of backgrounds and experiences. So that part's worked out very well. You and I talked just briefly about the report that was in today's IJ on the COVID-19 inflicting roughly 75% of those contracting COVID are of Latino descent, and many within our canal area. And I was pleased with your response when I asked about it. And maybe just take another minute, if you would, Jim, to maybe touch on the highlights that you passed on to me today. I was impressed with your response.
Sure, Mayor. So in my report, I was talking about where we have areas of greater positive concentrations. There's a number of different things we're doing. One of them is increasing the testing. That's a really important one. It's just making sure that people know when they're positive so that we can go through the contact tracing or through the county of Marin and other partners and make sure that people that they're spending a lot of time with are aware of it as well and can get tested themselves. So there's been quite a bit of testing that's been added over the past few weeks. There's mobile testing sites that actually go out. The county's sending mobile sites to assisted living and congregate care facilities. And then specifically in the canal, there's multiple sites that have been at the Canal Alliance and also at the West America Bank area. So testing is a big part of it. There's also just kind of education, making sure people understand how important it is to wear a mask and the physical distancing. There's other things that we've been doing to try to assist. We've added, for example, just more portable hand washing stations and hand sanitizer stations and things like that. We've had code enforcement employees who have been working with a lot of the businesses, particularly the larger grocery stores, and talking about ways that they can participate in creating an environment that's more safe. So there's a lot of things like that that are happening. And of course, through Marin County, working with nonprofit partners, looking at trying to assist people that are positive that can't be working right now, both in quarantine and isolation, and also in some cases where people qualify in income replacement as well. So couldn't say enough about our counterparts at the County of Marin and the good work that they're doing in this area as well.
Good, and thank you. And I found that interesting. I hope the others did as well, including those who might be watching today. And speaking thereof, let's move to the consent calendar, an opportunity for the community to address us on those areas, items that might be of interest to them or thoughts they wish to convey to us. So I'll ask our city attorney if there are anyone from the public that wishes to address the council.
This is for open time, correct? Okay. If you are participating by telephone and you wish to speak, please press *9. While I wait for the participants to press *9 who are on the telephone, I'll ask that if you are on YouTube, if you please note that when you're submitting comments, you need to write public comment prior to your message in order for us to read it into the record. And I'll ask that those be submitted now. And I'll just wait one moment. Okay, we have a couple comments on YouTube. The first is name withheld. Why are hair salons open in Marin County when we are on the governor's watch list and San Francisco is still doesn't have a reopening date for hair salons? This is a high-risk activity. Our second comment is, my name is Etta Ruiz. I hope the mayor, city council, and everyone on the task force recognize the goal has shifted from 8 can't wait to 8 to abolition. Hope you look into abolition. And I see no comments on the telephone. And that concludes public comment for open time.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the input for those that provided. We'll now move to the consent calendar, which are on the agenda items 4A through H. Any public comment with regard to the agenda items? And then we'll turn to the council.
If you are participating by telephone and you wish to speak, please press star 9. While I wait for participants to press star 9, I'll also request that public comments be submitted on YouTube. And I will note again that if you're participating on YouTube, you do need to write public comment prior to your message and introduce yourself in order for them to be read into the record. I'm going to wait about 15 seconds. I see no comments on the telephone and no comments on YouTube.
Thank you. In which case, any comments by council members on these items, which will be covered by a single motion? I see none, and therefore a motion would be appropriate with regard to the consent items.
I move that we approve the consent calendar.
Thank you.
Second.
Moved and second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Collin,
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin,
Aye.
Councilmember McCullough,
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Item matter carries 5-0. Move to special presentations, Juneteenth. And I'll ask Jim if he wishes to start us off on this item.
No, Mayor, I'm gonna turn it, I'll see if she's on. I was gonna turn it directly over to Antoinette Bullock, who is a community service officer in our police department. Oh, there she is.
There she is. Good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks.
We look forward to your comments.
All right. Well, my name is Antoinette Bullock. I want to first extend my gratitude to our San Rafael Police Chief and the City Council for inviting me to speak at this month's City Council meeting. I've worked for the San Rafael Police Department for 18 years in positions such as 911 dispatcher and community service officer. Our nation recently celebrated Independence Day this past weekend. And I had to take a moment and reflect on the words that resonate with all of us. According to the Declaration of Independence, dated July 4th, 1776, that all men are created equal. Yet this wasn't necessarily true for African Americans until almost 90 years later. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln, January 1st, 1863. But it wasn't until 2.5 years later, June 19th, 1865, when the federal troops came into Galveston, Texas to enforce the law of the abolishment of slavery. This day in history commemorates what we now know as Juneteenth. Celebrating Juneteenth is a time to rejoice in fellowship, spirituality, food, music, and so much more. It's also a time of remembrance of the pain and the struggle and the resilience of our ancestors. I'm currently the only African-American woman within the San Rafael Police Department, and I'm proud of this community for moving towards change. And this is just the beginning. With this resolution, annually on June 19th, the City of San Rafael will acknowledge the celebration of Black history as now our American history. Thank you again tonight for having me.
Well, thank you, Antoinette. Nicely presented, and we appreciate your input and the statements you made. And I was going to say the fun you bring to the department, but maybe that's not appropriate. I don't know. But anybody that knows knows what I mean. In any case, thank you so much for joining us this evening for the resolution. I'll ask if there are comments and turn to public, and then return and we'll take our action on this resolution. Any comments from council members? Vice Mayor Collin.
I just wanted to thank Antoinette for bringing this to the council. This is a community-wide conversation, and I agree with the mayor that the comments you just made were both informative and important, so thank you.
Councilmember McCullough, I apologize.
Yeah, I too am very supportive of the resolution, and I think it's just in reading the language of the resolution, I think it's the language is important, the intent is important. This is an important moment for all of us, and so I think it's terrific that we're seizing the opportunity
Absolutely.
to pass this resolution. But I would ask that we consider making one modest change to the language of the resolution, and perhaps you can consider the change I'm proposing while we take any public comment, and then when we come back, if there's a consensus in support of this change, then we can determine that. My proposal is that we change one word in the fourth recital. So the fourth recital is the paragraph that starts, "Whereas we find ourselves in a critical moment of reckoning." If you read that paragraph, that recital, the last sentence, the last complete sentence reads, "We understand this moment to be one where we must invest in, support, and edify African American lives." I would prefer to change the word edify to respect, so that that last sentence reads, "We understand this moment to be one where we must invest in, support, and respect African American lives." Judging from the context of this, that seems to be the intent.
Yes.
I don't know if edify was the right word, but that's my recommendation.
I like it. I like it.
Thank you.
That works for me. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. We'll address it in a moment after the public comment. Anyone else? In which case, can we turn to public? Lindsay, thank you.
Yes. If you are participating by telephone and you wish to speak, please press *9. And while I wait for participants to press *9, I'll ask the public comments be submitted on YouTube. And please note that when submitting comments, you do need to write public comment prior to your message if you would like it to be read into the record. Just going to wait a few more seconds. There's no hands raised on our telephone, and I'm just waiting for any YouTube comments to be typed in and submitted.
Thank you. And let's start with Antoinette. Is that suggested change by Councilmember McCullough? Does that seem appropriate to you?
Absolutely. And thank you for even mentioning that. I think it's a great change. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are no more public comments.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean to
No, that's perfect.
get ahead of myself there. In which case, a motion would be appropriate with the change of edify to respect as proposed by Councilmember McCullough. And thanks for doing so. Is there such a motion?
I make a motion that we approve this resolution regarding Juneteenth with the aforementioned edit.
And second.
And seconded. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Collin.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Councilmember McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye, and that matter carries unanimously. And Antoinette, thanks again for helping us address this important issue.
Thank you, sir. Good night, guys.
Bye-bye. We'll now turn to public hearings. Agenda item 6A, 1499 Lucas Valley Road Environmental and Design Review Permit and Exception. I presume there's a staff report associated with this.
Good evening, Mayor. Before I begin, I think maybe the city clerk can help me. There we go. Start my video. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and council members. This is a 8.9 acre hillside property located in North Santa Fe, abutting county open space and a trail system. The site is located in Santa Fe, but access to the site does come from Lucas Valley Road, unincorporated portion of Santa Fe. The project that's before you this evening is a request for a design review permit to add a 901 square foot addition to the existing single family home. The project also requires an exception to the planned development zoning for the existing single family residence to exceed a 6,500 square foot cap. The proposal would increase the main residence size by 901 square feet to 9,493 square feet. This exception is the reason why this item is before the council, as the plan development zoning requires the exception to be considered by the council to ensure the highest level of scrutiny. The current plan development zoning allows additions to single family home and clearly states that it is possible through this exception process. Typically, single-family homes are only allowed 6,500 square feet. But when this property was subdivided and first developed, it was not subdivided into multiple lots. It wasn't made into 4 or 5 different lots, but kept as one large estate. And in consideration of that, the plan development zoning acknowledged that and allowed a greater floor area than would typically be allowed on a single lot. Some of you may recall the site went through a similar process in 2012 with the ultimate city council approval of an exception and design review permit for what was approximately a 2,000 square foot addition at that time. The project before you does comply with all applicable design and development standards. Staff from the Public Works Department, Building, Fire Prevention, and the Marin County Parks Department have reviewed the project and did not have any concerns and recommended approval with certain conditions. To date, we have not received any public comment on this project, neither at the design review stage or at the planning commission stage. The project was reviewed by the design review board subcommittee, and on May 12th, the planning commission also reviewed the project and unanimously recommended approval. So staff is supportive of the project and recommends approval, given that the significant size of the property, limited visibility of the addition from other private properties or any kind of public right-of-way, and that the location of this addition is at the rear of the existing home and would have minimal visible impacts. So that concludes my staff presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and the applicant is also here to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Rob, for your report. Any questions of staff or the applicant? I see none, and therefore I'll ask if there's public comment with regard to this item.
If you are participating by telephone and you wish to speak, please press star 9. And while I wait for participants to press star 9, I will also request public comments be submitted through YouTube. Please note that when submitting comments on YouTube, to write public comment in advance of your message so that you would let us know that you'd like it to be read into the record. And I'm seeing no hands raised on the telephone. And I'm seeing no public comment on YouTube, but give me 1 second. I just want to make sure they have time to type them in. I'm going to wait about 5 seconds. There's no public comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Return to council, close public, return to council for follow-up questions, observations, questions, or...
Mr. Mayor, could I ask a question?
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah. I think I'm directing myself to staff or possibly the applicant's representative. But in looking at the architectural plans, the proposed addition appears to be at the rear of the existing structure. And there are contour lines or elevation lines that I can't tell for sure whether the addition will be perched above a hillside or built into a hillside or close to a hillside. There does seem to be a screening wall, which may also be a retaining wall. That would answer my question. But if you could confirm, is it perched above or is it nestled into a change in elevation?
Rafi, I think that's first addressed to you.
Yeah, so I think it's a tad of both. It is tucked behind in a already developed and graded area. And I do have some plans here, and the architect can probably shed a little more detail on that for you.
Councilmember McCullough, would you prefer a follow-up discussion from the architect?
If the architect could answer it simply, that would be terrific.
Okay.
Sure.
We arrange for that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Maureen Jokum. I'm the architect on the project. Yeah, when we built out the addition towards the hillside, the grade starts going up, so we had to cut into the hill. So it's actually built into the hill. And we have retaining walls on that outside corner, as you can see in the section, because the hill the grade goes pretty high up above when, behind the property. And the reason we have a series of retaining walls is because we need access to the developed part of the backyard, because on the opposite side of the house, there's no way of getting any equipment into the backyard because there's stairs to go around the house. So on this side, we did a series of retaining walls and minimize their height to get this path to get to around the house to the backyard. But that's pretty indicative. That section in the middle that you see there is pretty indicative. The house starts at grade at one point, and then as the hill goes up, the house has to be built into the hill to keep the same floor elevation.
Thank you. Councilmember McCullough, follow-up?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. No, that answers my question, and it confirms my suspicion that, or my takeaway here, that I can't imagine a more discreet addition given how it's built into the hillside and with a retaining wall around it. I have no objection to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. Any other comments, questions? John Gamblin, Councilmember Gamblin.
Yeah, I would just say that I concur with Councilmember McCullough. I've walked that Terra Linda Ridge Trail numerous times, and it's the only time you can see this property. So the lack of any visual impact to neighbors or public right of way is I don't see that there's any. So I would imagine that's why there's a lack of any appeal or public comment on this, because you really can't see the place unless you're up on that hill looking down on it. So.
Yeah, good point. And it appears that a motion might be appropriate, John, if you wish to offer.
Sure. Let me get to that. I make a motion that City Council adopt the resolution conditionally approving the environmental design review permit and exception.
Thank you. There's a second. Moved and seconded. I'm sorry, I missed the seconder.
Second.
Councilmember McCullough, second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Collin.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Councilmember McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye, matter carries 5-0. We'll move on to other agenda item 7A, General Plan 2040 Transportation Standards. Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, Mayor Phillips and City Council members. We actually have a three-part staff presentation for you this evening on this topic, which is the continuing discussion of traffic methodologies, vehicle miles traveled or VMT, and level of service, and the standards for these methodologies. And I want to start with an initial background on this topic, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob Grandy. Bob is with Fair and Peers. They're transportation consultants that are experts on the topic of VMT. In fact, they assisted the state of California when this legislation was developed. And Bob is going to go through our program that we put together for VMT standards. And then we're going to conclude with a presentation by Rafat Ray, our city traffic engineer, who will be covering the level of service recommendations. We also have Barry Miller at the sidelines here. Barry is going to be overseeing the PowerPoint presentation since there are multiple presenters here. This is the third round of review of this topic by the City Council. This topic is rooted in changes in the CEQA guidelines through Senate Bill 743, a legislation which was actually signed by the governor in 2013. In June 2019, there was an introduction of this topic and this legislation to the City Council. And at that time, we reported that this legislation mandates that we replace level of service in our CEQA review, which we have historically used for traffic review since the mid-1980s, with the introduction of vehicle miles traveled, which takes a look at reducing travel time and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Then we had a second meeting with a deeper dive on this topic in December, with a particular attention given to VMT, how it works, screening measures, thresholds, and what types of mitigation are typically required for this type of methodology. So Barry, could you move on to slide number 2? So the objectives for tonight are to bring forward policy on VMT CEQA standards, as well as level of service policies as well. Second slide. Now go back to slide 2, please. I just want to mention that, as previously reported, the legislation does allow local jurisdictions to continue using level of service as a tool for planning, development review, and road network management. We're just not allowed to link it or tie it to CEQA and environmental review. I also want to mention that the timing is critical and optimal because the transition to VMT actually went into effect on July 1st, and we are near completion with the draft General Plan 2040, for which this is a significant element. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. So switching from VMT to LOS has been a challenging task. The two methodologies are complete opposite, and they have different purposes and outcomes. In fact, this is a classic case of comparing apples and oranges. And for this reason, staff prepared a table, attachment 1 in your report, to demonstrate how they compare, differ, and their individual purposes and outcomes. And this slide actually is a shorter version of that table, and simply stated, level of service focuses on operations and impacts to the local street network and managing vehicle congestion and planning for road capacity. And level of service, as you know, uses a letter grade approach to gauging congestion, and the community has grown to understand it over the last 35 years. VMT, however, focuses on traffic at a regional level. It assesses impacts of travel distance from origin to destination. So that means that the greater distance between work and home means that there's a greater VMT impact. And the goal of this is to actually place housing closer to to employment and the workplace in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Barry, could you move on to the next slide, please? We are at a point where we are prepared to move forward with policy recommendations this evening, and the recommendations presented tonight are covered in the report, are based on the 6 points here. One is complying with the state guidelines, this new CEQA guidelines of phasing in vehicle miles traveled. The second, as I mentioned, we're working on our general plan, which provides perfect timing for introducing this into our general plan. The recommendations also take into account the feedback we got from the City Council in June 2019, and then the second meeting in December. Input from our General Plan Steering Committee. We got input from community groups, particularly from Responsible Growth Marin. You will find in the staff report attachment, there is a Q&A. Responsible Growth Marin provided some very detailed questions to us on both VMT and level of service, and we responded to those questions. And then lastly, carrying forward some of the established practices in our General Plan 2020, particularly with regard to level of service that we intend on continuing to use for policy. So Barry, would you go on to the next slide, please? I do want to mention that the recommendations consider the prior direction of the City Council, including tailoring standards to our local conditions, maximizing the need for CEQA overrides, or minimizing, the need for CEQA overrides and exceptions. This is of particular concern because we have areas of that are outside of our downtown, and that are areas that we expect some growth. And so we have to take this into consideration in looking at vehicle miles traveled. We also are looking at retaining level of service for use in planning and development review, with consideration of exempting level of service in our downtown. And then, of course, continuing to collect traffic improvement fees based on trip generation. And at this point, I will turn it over to Bob Grandy with Farron Piers, and he will run through a summary of our VMT recommendations.
Thank you, Paul. As Paul mentioned, SB 743 eliminates the use of auto delay from the determination of CEQA transportation impacts. This chart shows where we've been over the 7 years since SB 743 was approved. Most notably, CEQA guidelines were adopted by the state in 2018 that specified VMT as the CEQA transportation metric to replace LOS. And with the law taking effect last week on July 1, Hello?
Bob, you there?
Thank you. Yes. Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
So the next slide, please. So SB 743 eliminates, as Paul mentioned, the use of auto delay from the determination of CEQA transportation impacts. The chart on the next slide shows that CEQA guidelines were adopted by the state in 2018 to specify VMT as the CEQA metric to replace level of service. And with the law taking effect last week on July 1, all transportation impact analysis for CEQA must now rely on VMT. Next slide, please. So local agencies are tasked with making three key decisions. The first is to define screening criteria. The second is to define numeric VMT thresholds. And the third is to identify VMT mitigation measures to address impacts that are identified. Next slide. The purpose of the OPR Technical Advisory is to provide technical recommendations regarding assessment of VMT, screening criteria, thresholds of significance, and mitigation measures. OPR recommends the following numeric VMT threshold: a per capita or per employee VMT that is 15% below that of existing development. Next slide, please. The data in this table was generated using the Marin County Travel Demand Model developed by TAM. TAM's base year model was updated from 2015 to the spring of 2019 conditions for the general plan update and validated to 2019 counts. This chart shows two additional scenarios: a 2040 no project scenario that is based on ABAG land use forecasts, and a 2014 general plan preferred alternative based on the draft preferred land use program for the pending general plan update. From left to right, the numeric columns include total VMT, and that's citywide, including the sphere of influence area, service area population, and VMT per service population. That rightmost column shows that the VMT per service population for the 2040 general plan preferred alternative is about 7% lower than 2019 baseline. So we see a decline in VMT per service population with the general plan preferred land use alternative. And it's also about 5% lower than the 2040 no project conditions, which is ABAG land use growth. Next slide, please. The first step in applying the new VMT process will be to determine if a project meets one of several screening criteria. The purpose of the screening process is to quickly assess projects to support the presumption that they would either reduce VMT or would generate VMT below the city's threshold, which would qualify the project as a low VMT generator. This type of screening is most appropriate for projects that are consistent with the general plan, are located in areas with existing low VMT generation rates, and have characteristics conducive to travel by transit, walking, or bicycling. For these projects, a project would be presumed to have a less than significant VMT impact. This table shows recommended screening criteria, the first 6 of which are consistent with OPR recommendations. And these screening criteria for land use projects include a small project, which would be those generating less than 110 daily trips, projects in low VMT areas, projects in proximity to major transit stops, 100% affordable housing projects, and local serving retail less than 50,000 square feet. Transit, bicycle, pedestrian, and roadway projects that do not lead to a measurable increase in vehicle travel would be screened. And the last screening criteria would apply to residential and local serving retail projects less than 50,000 square feet in downtown Santa Fe. Next slide, please. For projects that do not meet one of the screening criteria, a quantitative VMT analysis would be required to assess whether the project exceeds a defined VMT threshold and thus results in an impact. If a significant impact is identified, mitigations would need to be identified as well. This table shows recommended numeric VMT thresholds for office, residential, office, and retail uses the threshold would be 15% below the existing regional average rate on a per resident or per employee basis. Mixed-use projects or area plans may evaluate each land use type individually or apply an aggregate metric. For other land use projects that other than the residential, office, or retail, the city may develop ad hoc thresholds. And lastly, for transportation projects that are not screened, projects resulting in a net increase in total VMT would create an impact. Next slide. So near-term VMT mitigations may include one or more of the following: the trip reduction strategies, a change in the project land use mix or density, mandatory TDM programs, or payment of the citywide impact fee based on the inclusion of VMT reducing programs and projects. Longer term, other options such as VMT mitigation exchanges or VMT mitigation banks may be available in the future to mitigate VMT impacts. So that concludes my presentation on VMT, and Rafat will conclude with a presentation on level of service.
Good evening, Mayor Phillips, members of the City Council. I just want to begin by saying how proud I am to be part of this professional team, a part of informed elected officials, and thank you for your patience in thank you for your patience in understanding with us the VMT complexities. And I think we finally got to the point where we can explain it, that the VMT's regional level service is local. And basically, the level of service is understood, and we heard that loud and clear in the first 3 or 4 rounds with the council, and a couple of rounds with the residents and the responsible growth of Marin. The level of service is understood, has been used since 1980. It's no longer required by CEQA, and that is a relief, because there is an expensive process for everyone involved, including the residents of San Rafael, when there's an EIR that involves CEQA mitigations and recommendations. We've surveyed and looked around for a number of cities, and our residents are very well informed, and they did that task as well. We range, from San Jose to San Francisco to Oakland to suburban community like Elk Grove and such. Every community had their own struggle in how are they going to comply with 743. And some maintained the level of service, other completely abandoned it, and some used a combination. As a point of reference, San Rafael shows the hybrid option, basically. Then that's what we're presenting to you this evening. We initially started by maybe suggesting a delay index, and we abandoned that because basically, as it's a good measure, but it's not really understood by the public, and we needed to keep it simple. And thanks again for your feedback and the community, and we are retaining the level of service. Next slide, Barry, please. And thank you, Barry, for being the quarterback on this presentation. Basically, the existing general plan policy has a level of service D citywide. Exceptions apply to specific intersections. And realizing that there are regional intersections within the downtown, and those at the I-580 and 101 off-ramps, they were exempt. And currently, City Council action is required to approve a project that exceeded the adopted level of service standard. Next slide, please. So policy M-2.5 details the intent that we're presenting to you today, maintaining the status quo for most of San Rafael, except the downtown, maintains level C standard, except where it's exempt right now at the 580-101, and certain intersections that by running the model for the 2040, we find out that it's either right now at E or F, or will go to EIF, to E or F in 2040. So whenever the restoration or the maintenance of the level service D is not feasible, and in those locations, it is not giving up on these locations. It is to continue to make sure that we exhausted all feasible mitigation measures at those locations. The downtown is we almost consider it in the precise plan as a special planning area, has its own mitigations and existing conditions and existing challenges. We exempt it from the level service as well. Next slide, please. Okay, the traffic studies will continue to be required. This is something that we heard loud and clear from discussions with the community. We will still use the level of service to maximize the mitigation and to continue to relieve the congestion with every tool that we have in the toolbox. Traffic improvement fees, which is an essential element of mitigating growth in general, will continue to be collected. And then we will draft a conditions for assessment, local traffic assessment. And I want to stop here and elaborate on this local traffic assessment. It is a specialized mini traffic study in the immediate vicinity of the proposed development, and it identifies measures to address congestion impact. The difference between the traffic studies that we've prepared in the last 20 years and the local assessment study is that we keep it local. Over the years, we mandated too many regulations, too many examinations of intersections that are within a mile or 2 miles of the development, and I believe that it's not really fair to put every developer or make them responsible for intersections that are way above and beyond their scope or the vicinity of their project. With this proposed policy 2.5 A, B, and C, the city's council action will be required to grant exception to level service and other standard-specific findings when we prepare this local traffic assessment. Next slide, please. The update of the traffic improvement fee is an important step for the city. It is part of the general plan amendment, general plan revision 2040, and we've had according to state law, there has to be a nexus between the projects and the fee, and that's we established by doing and updating the TIF or the traffic improvement fee studies. We will be focusing on updating the list of projects, coming back to you with a reasonable assessment of the cost, the feasibility, and the trip generation forecast, and that's how we would come to an agreement to a cost per trip. And we're planning to come back to the City Council later this summer to review the project list and fee recommendations. Next slide, please. The requested actions from the City Council seems very straightforward. Approve the proposed screening criteria and threshold for the vehicle mile travel policy, and approve the proposed approach to level of service. And I will turn it back to Paul Jensen to explain next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafat. Just one more slide on next steps. Minor changes to the VMT screening criteria and level of service policies will likely follow the City Council action. We're going to be looking at some further minor changes. Other general plan policies will be revised for internal consistency. As Rafat mentioned, we will be returning to the City Council later this summer with the traffic improvements and fees. And then, of course, the City Council will consider the final version of the policies during its review of the general plan later this year. And then lastly, I want to mention that the guidelines will be prepared for application of VMT criteria and thresholds and the local traffic assessment for downtown and intersections. This is one of the items that was requested as part of our outreach and the feedback that we received. I do want to acknowledge that we did get some correspondence for this item this evening. The one that's probably most notable is from 3 residents in North San Rafael, Petra Pless, Pamela Reeves, and David Smith. Very detailed comments. Some of the comments acknowledge that this work is in progress and that more will be available later on. There's some suggestions for some changes in some of the wording, which we will review. And then there are some technical questions about VMT and LOS. If the time comes, perhaps Bob and Rafat will be able to respond to those. So that concludes a very lengthy staff presentation. Thank you for your comments, or excuse me, your patience.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone that made the presentation, and you've done it several times, so we appreciate each and every one. I'll start with questions or comments from council members and then go to the public. Anyone on council? Vice Mayor Collin.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I think this question is probably for Paul. In the staff report, it talks about the TDM programs, and it almost makes it seem like that's something that will be looked at down the line as a mitigation measure, or we might have to take on additional staff. Like, what would be the implications for the cities regarding TDM mitigation plans? If you could just expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, in fact, that is a very good question, because the implementation of VMT is real critical in how the mitigation measures are implemented over time. And a lot of it relies on a TDM, or transportation demand management. And these are things like carpooling, or perhaps adding bicycle lanes, or adding housing to a commercial project, things of that nature. And in other communities where they've already adopted the VMT thresholds and the program and have started implementing TDM, it has required taking on additional staff to manage this, because it does require monitoring over time, going back to some of the project sponsors to get annual reports and things of that nature. So that will have a life beyond just adoption of these policies and standards. And Bob, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
No, I think the only thing I would add is that this would only apply to those projects that are not screened and go through the quantitative analysis and an impact is identified. So generally speaking, it's going to be very likely larger projects that have to go through the quantitative evaluation process. And typically they are required to report back on the measures that they've implemented and how successful they are. And one of the sort of more common measures that's generating a lot of discussion right now is work from home and how that will evolve over time, given where we are with COVID.
And I don't know, one follow-up question, Mayor. I don't know if it's for Bob or Paul. Has there been examples of a regional approach to hiring like a TDM management person? Because the reality is we might only have a handful, if even, projects. So is that something we could share with other jurisdictions?
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to respond to that. We've even had discussions with TAM about the possibility of perhaps some sort of a joint service process that would involve all of the cities and towns in Marin, because everyone's going to have to do that. By the way, we're the first one out here. They're watching us. So, and, you know, it's not gotten any legs yet, but that seems like that's a possibility. They have the resources. You know, we could work with them as the lead. But again, we haven't had a lot of detailed discussion on this. And again, Bob and Rafat, I don't know if you have anything to add to this.
I think that's a great idea, and it is something that is not part of the general plan. It is something to be worked on, and the regional approach has worked for many regional transportation agencies, where the TDM, you know, the TDM measures are, it's a list of things that could be done. The trick is having the teeth in the law to have people comply on an ongoing basis, and that's what requires the staff and the attention that the local agencies, you know, as big as San Rafael, is not really used to managing this program. You know, as cities get above 250 population, you'll find that most of those cities have a dedicated staff for TDM and have the right ordinances for it. So it is work in progress, and we will pursue the regional approach.
There's a good example right across the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge in West Contra Costa. WICTAC is a subset of the CCTA, the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, and they have a TDM coordinator that works with all the cities in Western Contra Costa County. So I think there are models to look at for that.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Bushy.
I have a question about the screening criteria. And this is going to require a historical perspective that I think Paul is well able to provide. Based on your experience, using those screening criteria, what fraction of the projects that would normally require a traffic study are going to be exempted in the future?
I think I would probably defer to both Rafat and Bob on that, because that's a little more technical than I think I can tackle. So
I can't imagine that, but okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me tackle the first, and maybe Bob can finish the answer. Basically, what is going to be exempt according to the recommended screening criteria are projects generating fewer than 110 daily trips. A single family home generates about 10 trips per day. So a development fewer than 11 single family homes is considered a small development according to this criteria. So this is the interpretation of the language to an actual project. Non-residential projects of 10,000 square feet or less, and multi-family residential projects with less than 20 units. We find that the multi-family residential have, in general, about 60% or 40% less traffic than a single-family home. So you can see the relationship of the 110 trips for the whole residential, let's say, single-family resident versus multi-family residence. So we're still talking about the 110 trips. These projects will be exempt and screened out from VMT.
Right.
Okay?
I understand that. I see the criteria. My question is, how does that translate into the real world in San Rafael? Are half of our projects going to be coming through without traffic studies now? Are 1%? What's your?
Okay, let me just add one more statement. Thank you for clarifying the question. I think it's going to be. It really depends on what projects we get into the future. Small projects in general will be exempt. This is today's criteria. Actually, we don't ask for a traffic study for anything that produces less than 50 PM peak hour trips, which is almost 500 daily trips. So we lowered the scale quite a bit. And if I'm to guess, I would say more projects will not be exempt. If you compare our current practices requiring a traffic report, we would be requiring more traffic reports now than we did in the past. And the reason why this 110 trips came from the OPR, Office of Planning and Research. They lowered the bar quite a bit before they can be screened. We had it much. Actually, they highered the bar, and we had it much lower.
So we're going to be seeing our developers, more developers are going to have to do traffic studies after this is adopted than before, right?
Okay, so let's talk about the traffic studies for a second, because the traffic studies are going to be, it's the scope of the traffic studies that's going to change, because the checking on VMT is a simple run of the model by saying that your VMT for this project is going to be X. They still have to answer more questions than just VMT. Let's say they pass the VMT. We still have to do local area analysis and see what other mitigation they can do, because remember, the VMT is a regional metric. We still need to check the local level and see, are there any queuing, any safety issues, any driveway issues, any signal timing issues. I mean, a whole lot of scrutiny is going to be given to development, as we do today. It's just that we will see probably more studies, but the scope of it will be limited.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I've got just a couple of questions, if I could. You mentioned that both VMT and LOS are apples and oranges, which has been my struggle up to this point, because I do think that perhaps not all, but certainly many in our community are concerned about the difficulty and sometimes a challenge of going across our city because of the congestion. And LOS at least gives us a picture of what that is or might become. VMT, it's not as readily apparent to me that VMT does that. So I'm glad that we're including, well, presumably we're going to be including both considerations. With regard to VMT, it's a basic concept, I guess. How does one know, if you want to take the walk in Terra Linda, how does one know where those residents are going to be traveling to? How do we know they're not going to San Francisco or Santa Rosa versus downtown San Rafael? I mean, the outcome with regard to VMT would be decidedly different, obviously. So how do we know that?
So it's a good question. For any project in Terra Linda that needed a VMT analysis, we would use a TAM model, and we would track the trips going to all destinations, whether they're inside San Rafael or inside Marin County or outside, because the OPR guidance and the state law that's been adopted says we need to track trips regardless of the endpoint. So we will be doing that and using the TAM model to do that. And as we move forward over the years, I'm sure that model, as models have over the 30 plus years that I've been doing consulting, will be enhanced and improved, and we'll have better data, to predict or to forecast where we're going in terms of both with VMT and in terms of volumes that will be used for the level of service analysis. Those both come out of the same tool. But the way that which we know, Paul, do you want to?
No, it sounds like that's post tense. That is, we're going to track the trips. Well, that would only occur after the development takes place, that you could track the trips. So again, I don't understand how you apply it in anticipation of a project.
Through the model, the way that we track that information is we have a whole host of different surveys. We have household surveys, we have census data, we have cell phone data, GPS data that tracks trips for different trip purposes and different trip land use types that are incorporated into the model and then used as a basis for estimating the origins and destinations of trips. So that helps us identify how many trips are being generated and where people are traveling. And that becomes the basis of our base year and then in our forecast year. So there's a lot of different data sources that we have, and those are expanding year over year. We have more and more data opportunities to track this information.
Sounds like we're putting a lot of faith in the database, if you will, and the data. And this is this is an extremely new process, and so I'm not sure that I'm completely comfortable, quote, relying on the database and the model, et cetera, et cetera. It seems less certain than I would prefer it to be. Under the proposed numeric VMT thresholds, you note that the threshold is potentially has potentially a significant impact. And I must I probably get tangled up in the words, but the first one is a residential project, and it says a proposed project exceeding 15% below the existing regional average. Well, I don't quite get that. I must say a project exceeding 50% below almost sounds like a double negative. And then it talks about regional average. What region are we referring to in our comparison?
It's a 9-county Bay Area region, and we have data on the average trip length per resident generated by households for the Bay Area as a whole.
Does that apply to San Rafael? I mean, does San Francisco apply to San Rafael? Does San Jose apply to San Rafael? It doesn't seem to me as it does. Maybe I'm missing the point.
Well, the point is to compare residential projects in San Rafael to the region as a whole and to see how the VMT rates compare. So we would look at VMT. We know, for instance, that from the latest data we have from the TAM model that residential projects in San Rafael generate less trips per capita than residential projects in the Bay Area as a whole, but office trips generate more trips per capita. And that's because the employees are coming from a greater distance and traveling. Many of those employees can't live in Marin County, and so therefore they travel from adjacent counties, and so they have longer trip lengths. So we're able to look at the characteristics of each different land use and compare a project in San Rafael to the Bay Area as a whole, which is what the state has set up as our threshold of comparing local rates to regional rates.
But it seems to me you've just indicated that our segment of the region is unique in some ways, and yet we're applying without exception. And I don't see where it says below existing residential average. I don't see where it says in parentheses, except for San Rafael, which is unique. And yet you seem to indicate that we are different than some of the other, quote, cities within the region. So how do we know we're going to get the right result if we're comparing? I'll go back to apples and oranges. It seems like even within the sphere, it's comparing apples to oranges in this regard.
It would not be comparing San Rafael to another city in the region. It would be comparing a residential project in San Rafael in a specific location and the rate for that. So we would identify the total VMT for that project, divide by the number of residents in that project for a residential project, and compare that to the regional average rate for residential. And if it's below that, by 15% below that rate, then it would be deemed to have a less than significant VMT impact.
Well, I'm still not completely comfortable with the reference because it seems to me that ours is going to be different than the other region. And so we're comparing it to that other region and expecting to get some meaningful result, which I'm not, quite frankly, I'm not completely convinced that it's going to work as smoothly as you might have said. Also, the sentence, proposed project exceeding 15% below. What does that mean?
So we can identify for baseline conditions the regional VMT per resident or per employee for different land use types. And so there is a fixed number that can be identified for on a regional basis for that VMT per capita. We then look at a project in San Rafael.
So does that mean instead of project exceeding, does that mean greater than?
So if the regional average is 10 VMT per capita, then that project would need to be 15% below 10 VMT per capita, or 8.5 or less, to be considered less than significant. So there is going to be a value, a numeric quantitative value associated with the regional average for each land use type, and that's the benchmark against which projects will be measured. And all projects in the Bay Area will be measured against that benchmark.
You know,
Let's go on. I'm curious how this all works out, quite frankly. John, I don't see you. I'm here. You're not on my screen. Oh, John, thank you. Do you have a question? Thank you. You weren't on my screen. Sorry about that.
It was just a follow-up to Councilmember Bushy's question in regards to the impacts and which properties are going to be impacted going forward. You know, we've heard, whether true or not, that San Rafael can sometimes be difficult for developers to come in and do projects just as it is now. Do we see this, and maybe this is to you, Paul, as a potential hindrance? I know everybody's going to have to deal with it. Every community is going to be the same, I would assume. But is this something that what we're proposing here that will put us in a different light than other areas? You know, especially in Northern San Rafael, where we're looking at kind of this hybrid type thing?
Well, actually, I could respond first, and then Rafat, if you want to add. No, the answer is no. Although I would expect that outside of downtown, and this is one of the things we're going to need to look at on the screening table, is we have opportunities, let's say in the Southeast San Rafael area, which is outside of our VMT area, where we're close to transit. It's further out. We have opportunities for industrial and office development growth out there. And so it is possible that if someone does an expansion, they're going to have to go through a VMT analysis. And so, yes, I mean, that's we're going to have to see how that works. But everyone else is kind of pretty much in the same boat when it comes to this. So unless you're near transit, you've got to go through that analysis if you're proposing something that's not screened out and smaller. So yeah, that's a possibility.
I mean, if I might elaborate, I mean, we have to all realize that with the VMT requirement, the load is heavier and the scrutiny is deeper on development projects. From the get-go, we as a team, including the council members, I mean, we were trying to think of a way to not burden the development community with the full extra load. So to answer your question directly, and then maybe this is Councilmember Bushy's questions as well, is that with the extra load, there will be more, but there will be more focused analysis. We made an effort to localize the study area. And that means that translates into $ to development, dollar and time, money and time for developers. If we focus the traffic report that is typically about 300 pages with all these indices in the back, to a traffic memo that is focused on the issues, focused on the impacts, that is a better tool for us to understand the projects and the impacts and mitigations than the big complicated reports that has a lot of fluff that not even traffic engineers read through every technical page. So I think that the analysis will be focused, but the additional load will be felt somehow.
I would say the fact that we have screening in the downtown for residential projects, which is a large share of the growth that's predicted over the next 20 years, being in the downtown area, means that those residential projects will be screened for VMT, and that they would just need to do the local traffic assessment, look at the immediate intersections and access points if they have parking around them. So that was a pretty big conclusion of our VMT analysis, was that new residential uses in the downtown are generating more than 15% below the regional average, and therefore could be part of screening for the downtown-wide area for residential. That's also true of employment uses within a half mile of the smart stations. So any projects built in those areas would also be candidates for screening as well. And so the VMT analysis would really be focused, I think, on larger projects and any employment projects greater than 10,000 square feet that aren't within a half mile of the smart stations. That's where I think you're going to see most of the VMT analysis is needed. And I think it'll be on a relatively small number of larger and employment-based projects not near the smart stations.
Mayor,
I can't wait for the first project to come through to see how this works in real life. But let's turn to the community. Any input, Lindsay? Any questions, comments from the community?
Yeah, there are.
Thank you.
First, if you are participating by telephone and you wish to speak, please press *9. And while I wait for participants to press *9, I'll also request for public comments to be submitted on YouTube. And please note that when submitting comments on YouTube, you do need to write public comment prior to your message and introduce yourself in order for it to be read into the record. So I'm going to move over to our YouTube comments. David Smith. I laud the bigger intent of VMT, but as one politician described it, it sacrifices the village to benefit the country. That translates to sacrificing Centerfell to benefit the state. This is why LOS should be used as well as VMT in order to protect Centerfell and its residents. Mayor Phillips' comment that Centerfell is not the same as the 9 Bay counties is completely on point. This is why we need to keep LOS. Scott Frerich. VMT definitions are narrow in scope with little knowledge how it will impact the community. I support the hybrid approach that retains LOS. Claire Hellenbeck. I hope the city keeps both the VMT and LOS methods of evaluating traffic as more perspective on this critical issue is clearly warranted. Shirley Fisher. For intersections and road segments that are already at LOS, E, and F, will City Council review projects for projects that affect those intersections and roads? Will intersections that are LOS E not be allowed to get worse to LOS F? How bad will LOS F be allowed to get? Name withheld. LOS should not cause projects in downtown to be denied. Downtown is better served by transit than any other part of the country. It is highly walkable and bikeable. LOS metrics should not get in the way of housing, retail, or civic uses in the downtown area. New residential in the downtown is exempt from CEQA, thus would not require VMT calculations. Would the consultant please confirm? And I'm going back to our telephone line, which I still see no calls. I'm going to give everyone one more second to submit any comments. It does seem like that concludes public comment.
Thank you, and thank you for the community comments. Paul, would you care to address the several points that came up?
Certainly. I actually, again, I'm sorry, a lot of this is outside my wheelhouse. I want to defer to Rafat regarding Shirley Fisher's comments about why we would exempt a level of service condition that's already at F, and if how to address the grade system once we reach F.
Well, that is definitely going to be on a case-by-case basis. Each project is going to be evaluated, and depending on what community benefit it brings, the location, the proximity to the intersection, there are multiple factors that will go into consideration, which is going to be a full consideration, showing how much each project is going to affect the intersections that are identified that will be impacted. So if we have a level of service F, we need to make sure that all improvements have been identified and checked for feasibility. It depends whether the project is on the 2040 traffic impact fee list. If it is, it becomes a matter of timing. We recognize that this project is going to have an impact on this intersection, and we would have a recommended action as to, we would tell the city council in their consideration that this intersection is programmed to be improved, and the level service will be whatever it's going to be at the time when it's improved. There will be when an intersection gets to a level of service F, the layman's interpretation of F is that you would sit as a driver maybe 1 or 2 cycles before getting through this intersection. What does that becomes to the driver is the queuing, and it becomes an impact of the queuing. So if a development comes in a highly impacted location, we would come to the council with information that could be understood by saying this level of service F means this, and this project is going to take it to the next level of F, where the V over C is going to be this much, the delay is going to be increased by this much, and these are what what we expect to see after this project. So I think Shirley has been raising this question from day one, and we responded to it in the questionnaire. And I think the bottom line answer, it really depends on the size of project, the proximity to the intersection, how much does it bring as an impact to this intersection. And it could be where, if such a huge project is going to come very close to a highly impacted area, where staff will come to the city council and say, this is a bad location for this type of use based on traffic. And it's going to aggravate the condition to this level. And this level is, you tell us whether it's acceptable or not acceptable. Our job is to bring it to you and explain the exact impact. I think the short answer again is it really depends on a case-by-case basis. Nothing is going to go through without a comprehensive, thorough study for all of the traffic elements.
Okay. We'll bring it back to council for any other additional comments before we take action. Councilmember Bushy.
I have a question. Is there any way that we could increase or modify the screening criteria to increase the number of projects that will be screened out of VMT?
Bob?
Well, the VMT screening has to meet the purpose of identifying low VMT generators. So, and ultimately the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the VMT being one of the ways in which GHG greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced. And so that requirement is in statute. So I don't think you couldn't add screening measures that would, for instance, allow you to screen a high VMT generating use and still be consistent with the statute.
Well, could we, for example, say projects that generate fewer than 150 trips per day? Could we do that?
Bob, let me respond to this because Councilmember Bushi, that was my question from day one, and I think the answer that I got is that after the Senate bill passed, there were some the Office of Planning and Research set a certain criteria as an interpretation of some high-level language, such as low VMT generator or high VMT generator. And the bar was set by the OPR guidelines. And the OPR guidelines specifically said 110 trips. And, we raised that question very early on and said, can this be 300 or 500? Why does it have to be 110? And the answer was, this has to be legally sound and consistent with the OPR guidelines. Bob, isn't that your answer?
The 110 trips is based on the exemption in CEQA for small projects, which generally refers to a 10,000 square foot or less project. And they sort of OPR identified 110 daily trips based on that small project exemption. So it's really tied to a current exemption that's in CEQA, that small project. And that's how they came up with that 110 daily trips per day is so.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'll give up on that one. How about the half-mile walking distance? Can we make it a 1 mile walking distance?
That's also in statute.
Right. Okay, so I'm getting the sense that we're at the maximum exemption. There's no other places in here, no obvious places that we could include, sweep more projects into the exemption. Is that a fair conclusion?
The transit stops is probably the most difficult one to change because it's the only one that's in statute, whereas all the others are in technical advisory, which is issued by OPR. And so there have been suggestions to raise the half-mile walking distance. There have been suggestions to eliminate that altogether and not have the screening for the transit stops. But that's difficult to do because it's in statute.
Okay. Is there anyone that we could change?
Well, I would say that the one that we've added, the downtown screening, is something that's not in the OPR, and including the entire downtown area as a screening area for residential certainly expanded the pool of projects that would not have to go through the screening process.
So we've done our extra already. That's our.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I need to. Thank you. Oh, Paul.
Yeah. Can I expand on that, Councilmember Bushy? One of the things, this is so new to us, and we're going to have to test this. And I expect everyone else is going to be going through the same test. And I expect that in a year or two, or maybe 3 years, some of this criteria is going to change anyway. And there might be a broadening of screening criteria. There might be a change in the thresholds. So we have to work with what we've got right now with the state law, which kind of ties our hands. I think there are some flexibilities in how we look at and define the screening criteria. I mean, there were a couple of suggestions that were made. My particular concern is outside of downtown, particularly in the southeast San Rafael area, where we have the most opportunity out, that is in an area where you're not close to transit per se, is that we're going to have a desire for, let's say, light industrial or office expansion. So we have to keep an eye on that, because I think those are the areas where they're going to end up triggering this VMT analysis, because they're going to be over that threshold. But we're going to have to play it out. We really are. So.
Thank you.
Councilmember McCullough. Excuse me for a moment. Mary Beth, you're done with your questions? I didn't want to cut you off. Okay. Councilmember McCullough, please.
Yeah, I want to express a concern that has been gnawing at me since reading the staff report and then listening to the commentary this evening. When this came to us earlier, that is the discussion about VMT and LOS and to what extent we retain LOS as a planning tool, I was positive, or that is supportive of the idea of retaining LOS and keeping a hybrid model in place, because I thought that LOS might be a counterweight or a counterbalance to VMT. In other words, because they analyze traffic and greenhouse gas emissions in very different ways, that if there were an adverse effect in the VMT analysis, perhaps an otherwise meritorious project could be saved by showing low LOS impact. That doesn't appear to be what's happening here. It appears that, in fact, we're creating two very different hurdles for a potential project that may have merit. Since VMT tends to discourage regional trips, and I'm generalizing here, and since LOS tends to penalize local trips, you might have a project that can't get approved because if you look in either direction, it gets stopped in its tracks. Now, of course, there's always the opportunity for extensive and perhaps overly costly mitigation, or there's an override by the council. But what we're doing here is we're putting up two roadblocks instead of one. The first roadblock, that is VMT, the one enshrined now in CEQA, and that would be the basis for traffic studies going forward, is very unknown and is probably going to take time for parties on all sides to figure out, and it's going to be probably expensive. If we overlay LOS on top of that, are we going to impede projects that we want to see happen in our community? So unless I'm missing something significant here and there's a quick answer that solves my concerns from staff, my view is I don't think we should keep LOS as part of this model. I think that we should consider dropping it right now and perhaps reincorporating it or adding it later, or looking at it as merely an optional way of viewing a project, but not as the basis for adding conditions of approval to the project, because I think it will have significantly adverse effects.
I don't know if anyone wishes to comment, but
I think
I strongly disagree, because I do think that their community is substantially interested in congestion in some of those areas, and VMT does not address that. So I think we'd be remiss to exclude that consideration. I understand your point, but still we have long-term consequences I think we need to look at. So I respectfully disagree with your conclusion.
What we've seen in other communities is that the scope of level of service analysis has declined considerably in the post SB 743 era. In other words, the number of intersections, the scale of the analysis that's been done has declined. And I think that's what Rafat was referring to earlier about, rather than having a project evaluate 20 or 30 intersections, it would be much more focused level of service analysis where it would be required. What most communities have done is they've said this, they refer to it as the LTA, local traffic assessment, which is really what I refer to as the four corners. So if you literally were to take a project that's being built and look at immediate access points and make sure it's actually going to function if you drop a project into a site, so that you're not, adding a project with parking in a driveway that's accessing right into your most congested part of the network. That's really what the LTA is supposed to do, and it's very focused. Most cities are requiring, even San Francisco and Oakland are requiring that projects do this LTA, really kind of focused assessment. And then the question is, do you go a little bit broader than that? And that would be something Rafat and the Public Works team would determine at that point. But I think the intent is that the scope, I should say, of level of service analysis would be much reduced from what we see today for most projects.
When and how will that be defined? In other words, when will we know what the scope of level of service analysis will be for projects going forward?
That's an excellent question, and that's basically the communication and the conversations with the community led to the conclusion that we will at some point come back to the council with guidelines for preparing traffic impact reports, or the TLA, or whatever we call it, the traffic and parking and circulation studies. There are some things that needs to be defined Cities have invested in developing these guidelines, so there'll be plenty of samples when we embark on that task. The reality of the situation is that we really don't have that many traffic reports that we review on an annual basis. We have a limited number of projects that would trigger the threshold of preparing such reports. And at the risk of repeating myself, there'll be more studies, but there'll be many studies. And I'm talking about the difference between preparing a $30,000 analysis versus paying $500,000 for an EIR that includes 42 sections that has nothing to do with the projects. So, we have to be reasonable. We have internal direction and from the city, from the council, from the city manager to make every effort to be fair and with every development as they come in. And we will develop that guidelines, a set of guidelines, and we'll come back to you with guidelines after the adoption of the policy. Many questions from the community was related to how, and we really don't know all of the hows right now. We know the what, we know the policy, we know we need the direction from the council, and we will get into the higher level of details later on.
Was it just the last question on this subject? Would it be, is an alternative, rather than accepting the proposed policy, the LOS policy, to shelve it for now and come back when we have a more fully articulated LOS policy and accept that as the policy going forward, and tonight only accept the VMT screening criteria?
I believe that this is a discussion for the council, and what we heard from the community is that there's not a lot of support for what we began doing, basically going with VMT only. It is an option for the council to consider.
Well, so then I'll limit my comment to this. I continue to hold this concern. Mr. Mayor, I do understand the countervailing concern you and others have, which is we can't ignore the quality of traffic coursing through our intersections. But I'm a little worried that we're going to adopt a VMT screening criteria. That's going to become the standard for assessing traffic and modeling traffic going forward. And then we're also going to have LOS, which we're going to be struggling with going forward until we come up with a model that we think works. I think let's adopt the VMT as we're required to do, and then let's work on that LOS model. Bring it back when we think that it meets the community's needs and ours, and approve it then when we better understand its contours. That's my view, and I'll stop right now.
Yeah, and I'll go to Vice Mayor Collins, but quickly, we've dealt with LOS since 1980 or thereabouts. It's not like we're recreating the wheel. I can't believe that that's going to be onerous to just continue what we've been doing for so many years. I don't see that as being a burden. Having said that, Vice Mayor Collins.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just had a follow-up question. The LOS, isn't that being used to look at the impact of the traffic versus a condition of approval? Right? So we're using it as a tool, and it's part of the data, part of the decision set, or part of what goes into the decision if it becomes for the council, but it's not a condition of approval as written, is it?
Well, not in the classic sense of condition of approval, but in essence, if, let's say, for example, under the current circumstances, well, now we're past July 1st, we don't do an LOS analysis and an EIR anymore, but the way we have this set up is if you exceed the level of service right now, you would need an exception from the city council. So in essence, that's a conditional action. So that's, I think, what we mean by a condition of approval. You would have to get an exception approved in order to exceed that level of service.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So I just wasn't sure when I was following up on Councilmember McCullough's questions. I mean, there's conversation that goes around it. It's part of a bigger decision. It goes into the whole decision-making part of it. It's not set in stone.
The other part of that could be a condition. Let's say a project results in level of service E and the standard is D, and they have to, let's say, do some intersection improvements. That's their condition as well, is that, they have to do the intersection improvements to make it, to make the intersection operate at the standard in which the city has adopted.
Okay.
John, John, any questions, input before we go to a motion on this matter?
Yeah, and Paul, just following up on that from Vice Mayor Collin, right now you were mentioning, or prior to the change in July there, that a change in LOS would be an exception that the council could approve. When these projects come to the Planning Commission going forward, if there is a change in the level of service, is that still going to be categorized in as exception, or they can just use that in their overall deliberation of the project, but yet it's no longer requires us to override it or grant it? Is it, the way that this is written right now, if that LOS stays in there in this kind of hybrid model with VMT and LOS, and there is a change, as you said, from D to E, and D is kind of the standard, is that still an exception piece that we have to approve, or is it now under the new rules that it's just there as a guideline that we can look at it and say, no, it's okay, the VMT is fine, they did all their other stuff, this LOS changes, what? And if that's the case, should we be looking at that same model for the rest of the city? Are we just saying, okay, we're going to carve out one part and have this kind of hybrid model in there? Is that something that we're going to run into issues with?
Well, let me answer your first question, and then maybe the second one Rafat can respond to. The way our current general plan is set up is we have an exception process. If you exceed a level of service and you cannot mitigate for that exceeded level of service, it requires, historically, it required an environmental impact report, and you have to make findings of overriding consideration. But our general plan was also set up that you had to secure an exception for that failed level of service from the city council. So if a project went to the planning commission and resulted in a level of service E or F or whatever, the exception would have to be still granted by the city council, unless, of course, they agree to a certain mitigation that reduces that level of service down to the acceptable level. Then they wouldn't need that exception anymore. We are proposing to carry that forward from our current general plan. So that exception process would still be held with the council, regardless of whether the project were solely approved by the planning commission or not. I don't know if that answers your question, Councilman.
It does, but does that put us at any advantage or disadvantage with any of our neighboring communities who, in a sense, are dropping LOS altogether and just doing VMT across the board?
Possibly, but frankly, I don't know of any communities that I'm aware of that are completely dropping LOS except for San Francisco and a couple of other big cities. Most of the cities the size of San Rafael, and Bob can confirm this. In fact, you mentioned earlier, they're retaining LOS in some form, whether it's, a status quo or something scaled back, but they're still retaining that. So, and I can't speak for the other communities in Marin, but because I don't even think they've even gotten this far on this whole policy issue, and those are in those other communities. But at least the ones that I know of outside of Marin County that are of similar size, they've kept LOS in some form. Bob, isn't that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, the most recent example, speaking of the Palo Alto City Council 3 weeks ago, and they did exactly what something very similar to what you're about if you adopt the recommendations, would be adopting, which is to retain LOS. And they have a similar 50 trip threshold that would trigger a traffic study to address that. And there are some small differences in screening criteria. They reduced their local serving retail size from 50 to 10,000 square feet. But other than a few small changes where they actually went more strict on the screening criteria, they're adopting a very similar approach. And I'm not aware of any other Marin County jurisdictions, cities that have even begun the conversation of adopting screening and thresholds. And I've talked to 3 or 4.
And that's my understanding. Are we prepared to go to a motion regarding this item? Councilmember McCullough, you don't have your mic on, so I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. Well, I mean, I'll make a motion. If there are 2 recommendations, if we do them in sequence, can I make a recommendation as to the first, or a motion as to the first recommendation?
I was, frankly, I was only prepared for one, but let me look at something.
Mr. Mayor, if that question's to me, the council member can certainly make a motion as to the first recommendation, and then there can be a motion as to the second recommendation. Okay,
then there are 2 recommended actions, so why don't we take the first one? Are you prepared, Councilmember McCullough?
Sure.
Okay.
I recommend that we accept the proposed screening criteria as set forth in recommendation number 1.
Is there a, excuse me, is there a second on this?
Second.
Moved and second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Collin.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Councilmember McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye, matter carries 5-0. We'll go on to number 2, second item.
Well, I'd like to make a motion, but I sense that there may be some opposition to it, but let me see if I can articulate it. I move that we delay accepting proposed policy M2.5 and ask that staff bring it back at a later date, more refined and with greater specificity as to how the level of service will be used in conjunction with VMT in approving a project.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and second. Roll call, please. Lindsay? Thank you.
Sorry about that. Councilmember Bushy.
No.
Vice Mayor Collin.
No.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Councilmember McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
No. No. Do we have a follow-up motion?
I'll make a motion that we accept the proposed approach to retaining LOS in General Plan 2040 and subsequent planning and development review procedures.
Thank you.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Collin.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
No.
Councilmember McCullough.
No.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye, that matter carries. Thank you, everyone. What an interesting discussion. Thanks for the consultants. We'll now move on to, excuse me, losing my voice. Move on to the grand jury report on cyber attacks. Rebecca, good evening.
Hi. Good evening, everyone. I'm gonna give a few seconds for a bunch of consultants to get off and some more consultants to come back on. So thank you so much for having us tonight. And good evening. I've got a staff report about a grand jury report that was published recently about cybersecurity practices among Marin's government agencies. And on the call tonight to assist with questions is Vin Pham, the city's data and infrastructure manager, Christian Kelly, Xantrion's chief technology officer, and Seth Peterson, Xantrion's director of client strategy. Thank you for bearing with us tonight. They all know a lot more about traffic than they knew 2 hours ago. So thank you for being here. Staff has prepared a draft response. It's in your agenda packet, and I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I do want to note a couple of modifications, and then we can open it up to questions and comments. So the first thing to note is we accidentally left off a recommended response for F10. So the finding 10 reads, various low-cost best practices exist that could, if implemented, significantly improve the cybersecurity posture of Marin cities and towns. We would recommend responding that we agree with that finding. While the city of San Rafael has implemented or is in the progress of implementing many low-cost best practices already, we would recognize this finding to generally be true. So we would recommend an agree response to that. And if a motion is made tonight, if it could include adding a response in for that. Also for F8, this finding read, the Marin County Council of Mayors and Council members has not made cybersecurity a priority, which has minimized the awareness and engagement of elected officials in cybersecurity matters. The draft response in your packet says disagree partially. However, upon further reflection, staff would also believe that an agree response could be warranted there. This response was a little challenging for us to develop. While I'm fairly confident the topic hasn't been on an MCCMC agenda in my memory, I'm also not aware if any of the subcommittees took this topic on, such as the legislative committee, that if they focused on any time on this. So I think you all would be in the best position to weigh in on that. I also find it hard to know if MCCMC not making it a priority leads to the conclusion that is why elected officials are not aware and engaged on the topic. My experience in San Rafael is our council is aware and engaged on the topic, but should you want to change that response to agree, I could see that would make sense. We kept our proposed responses to San Rafael's experience. Many of the findings spoke in a generality of all the Marin cities and towns. It's very challenging for us to comment on the practices of other cities. And so we kept our responses to the experience of San Rafael and didn't comment on the cybersecurity practices of cities and towns. That said, we agree that further sharing and collaboration amongst government agencies would be beneficial. And I also want to express gratitude to the County of Marin's Chief Information Security Officer, Jason Valderrama, who I think is really championing this topic and convening cities and towns to talk about it. And I think he is a rising tide that's lifting all the boats. So grateful for the county's leadership in this area. And I think pulling us all together to talk about this and share resources and have further conversations about what we can do together will be beneficial to us all. I thought I would use this opportunity to just briefly update all of you on some security measures that have been strengthened recently. As you know, in November, the city contracted with Xantrion for managed IT services. And in part, this company was selected because of their strong expertise in security. Since then, Xantrion has greatly improved our posture with additional improvements on the horizon. They bring new resources that we didn't have in-house before and access to security tools that could have been challenging for us to afford on our own. So just a few highlights, and then we can open it up for questions. We now have daily offsite backups, which improves our ability to recover from a potential attack. We have deployed a new and improved antivirus, internet filtering, and email security measures. Xantrion has implemented comprehensive security patching for both our systems and applications. Many of our Windows 7 devices have been upgraded to Windows 7, and security licenses were purchased for the remainder that have not been upgraded. We've started rolling out multi-factor authentication to all users. I think all of you, as well as about 80 other users, and then we're on track to have that fully in place with all of our users by the end of the summer. We just rolled out another 45-minute mandatory cybersecurity training recently, and we'll continue to do that on an annual basis regularly. Xantrion has a monitoring system in place to detect early signs of identity compromise. Just in the past few months, they were able to detect 3 instances of attempted compromise and remediate them before any damage was done. We've rolled out mobile device management to all public safety cell phones and are soon going to roll out mobile application management to any user with an app on their phone that connects to the city network. And so that's, in short, some of the accomplishments that we have made with Xantrion coming on board last November. We're very grateful for the expertise they bring and the resources that they bring to the table. And with that, I will open it up to any questions. And I think I've got a team here to be able to answer them.
And we shall open to questions and comments from the others. But I must say that having read the report, I was very proud of the efforts of our city, certainly exemplified by the 3 of you, and I felt good about what I saw in the report. Whereas some of the other cities perhaps couldn't make the same statement, we clearly have the situation, it appears to me, in good stead. So thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the report, the comments, and the answers to the various questions. I said, frankly, I felt very good about it. But with that, are there questions? Vice Mayor Cullen.
Thank you, Mayor. And it's actually not a technical question. It's more, does everybody at the city take the 45-minute little module? I finally got to it's a little bit overdue, because to me, having taken those regularly, it really does hit home. Wow, I actually have to pay attention. And all of us, we get so many emails from people we don't know all the time. So I was just curious, other than the council, does everybody in staff do those?
Yes. Every user that has access to the city network, we make it mandatory that they take that training.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, even though they're very straightforward, I mean, they're not difficult or rocket science, but they are good reminders. So I would love to give that feedback. So thank you for having us do that, even if it takes some of us a little longer to get to it.
Yeah, and I think what's great about them is they protect you not only at work, but they protect you at home. So I think you can imagine we're getting hit in all directions right now with the cybersecurity threats. And since the massive work from home trend that has occurred because of COVID, the cybersecurity attacks have just gone through the roof. And so it's been really great to have Xantrion as a partner through this. We've implemented in the last couple of months a lot of different measures that I think have made us stronger in the long run as well.
No, thank you.
Good comment. Good question. Councilmember McCullough.
Oh, yeah, my question is, how frequently do we as a city, either internally or with Xantrion or some other vendors' help, how frequently do we assess and score our sort of technology security compliance efforts?
I'm not sure how to answer that.
I guess maybe put another way, we all know that cybersecurity is kind of an evolving threat. And as municipalities or entities get better at patching weaknesses, new threats emerge. How frequently are we assessing the landscape, looking at those new threats, and ensuring that we're staying abreast of them?
So I had to wrap my head around the question. At first, I thought maybe comparing ourselves to other cities and towns. But I think Christian, maybe you can speak about just your internal practices around the landscape.
Absolutely. I hope you can hear me okay. So yeah, Xantrion has an internal team that is constantly evaluating and keeping up on the threats that are coming out from multiple feeds. We get information from the FBI, we get information from kind of government and municipalities, as well as corporate sources. So we're constantly kind of, ingesting this data and understanding, if there's a critical threat out there that we need to mitigate against, or, we're able to look at the practices and the controls that are in place at the city and evaluate them against many other clients that we work with to kind of understand kind of the city's profile. And obviously what we've been trying to do, and we are going to continue to do, is bring up the controls in place with, the layers that we're adding with multi-factor authentication and other controls that we're putting into place, bringing the city up to a level that we feel meets the level of attacks that are coming in. So there's always that balance between how many controls we put in place, which makes life difficult for people at, how to get their jobs done versus mitigating against the threats that are incoming. So we try to have a good balance there. But that is something that we're constantly doing, yes.
Okay, thank you.
John, do you have a comment? I can't see you. I apologize.
No, I don't.
Okay, very good. Public comment. Now I can. Public comment?
Yes,
Any?
thank you. If you're participating by telephone and you wish to provide public comment, please press *9. And while I'm waiting for folks to press *9, I'll request public comments to be submitted through YouTube. Please note that when you're submitting comments on YouTube, to write public comment prior to your message and introduce yourself if you'd like it to be read into the record. We have no attendees over the telephone. And I'm gonna wait about 10 to 15 seconds for YouTube.
We're good to go. In that case, let's bring it back, close public, bring it back to council for further follow-up questions or a motion with regard to adoption of the resolution, including the change to F8 and the addition of F10. Is there such a motion? By somebody.
So moved.
So moved. And seconded by?
Second.
Thank you. Moved and second. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Bushy.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Cullen.
Aye.
Councilmember Gamblin.
Aye.
Councilmember McCullough.
Aye.
Mayor Phillips.
Aye, matter carries 5-0. Thanks, everyone. Good job, Rebecca and team. Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you.
In which case, moving on to near conclusion. Any council members' reports, requests for future agenda items by any council members? I see none. There is no successor agency, and therefore we shall adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
See you.
Good night.
Aye.
Night all.
Night, night.